They said no woman had ever survived a night as the Duke of Blackwood's bride. Not survived in the way of ghost stories or locked towers, but survived in the way that mattered most, survived with her dignity still whole, her heart still unbroken, her name still unscarred by the morning light. Every woman who had walked through those iron gates as a bride had walked back out before dawn, some in tears, some in silence, and one, they whispered, in such a state of quiet devastation that she refused to speak his name for the rest of her life. The ballrooms of London had made a legend of it. Mothers warned their daughters, fathers reconsidered their ambitions. And yet the Duke of Blackwood, Sebastian Blackwood, remained exactly what he had always been, unmarried, untouchable, and utterly indifferent to every story told about him. Evelyn Hartwell had heard every version of the story. She had heard it at breakfast tables and in drawing rooms, in the careful murmurs of women who believed themselves out of earshot, and in the blunt declarations of men who thought the whole thing was terribly funny. She had listened to all of it with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that listening carefully is the only real advantage available to a person in her position. She was the second daughter of Lord Hartwell of Wiltshire, which meant she had grown up understanding that the world did not owe her very much. She was not the eldest, not the heir, not the beauty the gossip columns preferred to write about. What she had instead was a mind that moved quickly, a patience that had been forged through years of being overlooked, and a very clear understanding of how close her family was to financial ruin. The Hartwells were not dramatically bankrupt. They were the quieter kind of ruined, the kind that still attends the right dinners and wears the right gowns and smiles at the right people, while the numbers in the estate ledger trend steadily downward. Evelyn had been reading those ledgers since she was 16, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had noticed that no one else was. She knew exactly how many years remained before the situation became irreversible. She had calculated it the way she calculated most things, carefully, without sentiment, and with a full accounting of every option available. That was why, on the night of the Wintercrest ball, when she overheard the conversation between her father and Sebastian Blackwood in the library corridor, she did not feel surprise. She felt the particular clarity that comes when a solution presents itself to a problem. You have been quietly holding for a long time. Her father needed the Blackwood name and the Blackwood resources. Sebastian Blackwood needed, it appeared, a woman who would not run. The terms were already being discussed in low voices behind a half-closed door, and Evelyn stood in the corridor and listened, and understood, and made her decision before the conversation was even finished. If you are the kind of person who enjoys stories about women who refuse to be afraid of the things they are supposed to fear, then stay with this, because this is exactly that kind of story, and it is only just beginning. The Wintercrest Ball was the most important social event of the winter season, held in the great hall of Viscount Pemberton's estate, a place so aggressively decorated with holly and candlelight that it managed to feel both magnificent and slightly oppressive. Evelyn arrived in a gown of deep green that her mother had selected and her sister had criticized, and she walked into the room with the particular composure of someone who has decided in advance that nothing tonight will catch her off guard. She had been to dozens of these events. She knew how they worked. You were displayed, assessed, discussed, and then assessed again by a different group who had not been paying attention the first time. She had always found it mildly exhausting and occasionally interesting, and she had learned to extract what was useful from the experience and discard the rest. She saw Sebastian Blackwood from across the room before anyone introduced them. It was not difficult. He was the kind of man a room arranged itself around whether it meant to or not, tall and dark-haired and composed in the manner of someone who has spent so long being watched that the watching no longer registers. He was not performing indifference the way some men did. The the exaggerated boredom of someone who desperately wants you to notice how little he cares. His was the real thing, the quietness of a man who has genuinely stopped expecting anything interesting to happen. He stood near the fireplace, listening to a conversation he was not contributing to, and his eyes moved across the room with the patient attention of someone cataloguing rather than searching. Their eyes met briefly, and Evelyn did not look away first. She did not do it to make a point. She simply had no particular reason to look away, and she had long since stopped performing nervousness she did not feel. He held her gaze for a moment with what might have been surprise, and then returned his attention to the room. She noted it, filed it away, and went to find her sister. It was 2 hours later, after the conversation in the corridor, after her father had come to find her with the particular expression of a man who is relieved and guilty in equal measure, after she had sat quietly in a window alcove and confirmed for herself that she had thought through every implication and still arrived at the same answer, that she agreed. She agreed not because she had no choice. She had made that distinction very clearly in her own mind. She agreed because the alternative was to watch her family's situation become irreversible, and because she had assessed the terms of the arrangement and found them, in their blunt practicality, more honest than most of what the marriage market offered. Sebastian Blackwood was not pretending to be in love with her. He was not offering romance or poetry or the kind of future that dissolves on contact with reality. He was offering a contract, and Evelyn had always understood contracts better than she understood promises. The wedding took place in early January, 3 weeks after the Wintercrest Ball, in a ceremony that was small by the standards of their respective stations and significant in ways that had nothing to do with flowers or music. Evelyn wore ivory silk and carried white roses that her mother had cried over and her father had barely looked at. Sebastian stood at the altar with the stillness of a man completing a formality he had committed to and intended to honor, which, Evelyn reflected, was more than could be said for many grooms she had observed. The vicar spoke, the vows were exchanged, and just like that, she became Evelyn Blackwood, Duchess of Blackwood, and the carriage that took them north through snow-dusted roads carried them away from everything she had known and toward a place she had only ever heard described in whispers. Blackwood Hall appeared at dusk, when the sky behind it had turned the color of an old bruise, purple and gray, and shot through with the last pale gold of a winter sun. It was larger than she had imagined, and quieter than she had expected. A great stone house that had been standing on this hillside for 3 centuries and had accumulated, in that time, the particular atmosphere of a place that has seen a great deal and given away nothing. The windows were lit from within, warm against the cold landscape, and Evelyn studied them as the carriage approached and thought, "Carefully, this is mine now, as much as anything can be mine, and I intend to understand it completely." Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, met them at the door. She was a compact woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes the color of winter slate, and she looked at Evelyn with the measured assessment of someone who has watched many women arrive at this house and has learned not to form opinions before morning. She welcomed them with precise courtesy, introduced the household staff with efficient brevity, and showed Evelyn to the rooms that had been prepared for her. They were well appointed and impersonal, and Evelyn noted both facts without judgment. She had expected impersonal. She had not expected the rooms to be quite so cold, not in temperature, which was carefully managed, but in spirit, the way a room feels when it has been maintained rather than inhabited. She changed without assistance, having dismissed the maid with polite firmness, and took a long time standing at the window, looking out at the darkened grounds. The snow had started again, soft and unhurried, and the world outside had gone entirely white and silent. She thought about the ledgers at Hartwell, about her mother's relief and her father's guilt, about the stories she had heard for years about this house and the man who owned it. Then she thought about what she actually knew as opposed to what she had been told, and found that the two categories were, as usual, quite different. When Sebastian came to her rooms an hour later, he knocked first, which she noted. He entered when she replied, closed the door behind him without drama, and stood in the middle of the room with the particular posture of a man who is about to say something he has decided to say plainly and without embellishment. He looked at her without apology and without warmth, which she had expected, and with something she had not entirely anticipated, a kind of careful respect, the attention of someone who is genuinely trying to see you rather than looking past you toward something else. He said he wanted to be direct with her about the nature of their arrangement. He said the marriage was one of obligation and mutual benefit. He required an heir to satisfy the terms of the Blackwood inheritance, and she had agreed to provide him with one. In exchange, the Hartwell debts would be settled, her family's estate would be secured, and she would have the full financial and social protection of the Blackwood name. He said these things the way people read from legal documents, not cruelly, but without the softening that most people apply to difficult truths because they are more comfortable with the impression of kindness than with honesty itself. Evelyn listened to all of it without expression, and when he finished, she said simply that she understood and that she had one requirement of her own. She required honesty. Not affection, not pretense, not the performance of a marriage neither of them had chosen freely, but honesty. If something was not working, she wanted to know. If he had concerns about her conduct or her management of the household, she wanted him to tell her directly. She did not want to be managed or protected from information she was capable of handling. She was not fragile, and she had no interest in being treated as though she were. There was a silence after she finished that lasted long enough to become interesting. Sebastian looked at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has prepared for several possible conversations and found that none of his preparations are quite applicable. He said after a moment that her terms were acceptable. She said his were as well, and that was how the first real conversation between the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood ended, with an agreement that was, by any reasonable measure, more honest than most marriages began with. If you are enjoying this story, do subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss what happens next, because what comes next is the part no one who gossips about Blackwood Hall ever bothered to find out. The morning after the wedding, Evelyn woke at 6, dressed without assistance, and went downstairs. She had not slept badly. She had, in fact, slept rather well, which she attributed to the cold air and the extraordinary quiet of a house this far from the city, and which the rest of the household, as she discovered later, would attribute to something else entirely. Mrs. Whitmore found her in the breakfast room at 6:30, already reading through the estate correspondence that had been left on the sideboard, and stopped so abruptly in the doorway that the silver tray she was carrying rattled. Evelyn looked up and said good morning and asked for tea if it was no trouble. Mrs. Whitmore recovered herself with admirable speed, set down the tray, poured the tea and said, carefully, that she had not expected to find her Grace awake at this hour. Evelyn said that she was generally an early riser and that she hoped it was not an inconvenience. Mrs. Whitmore said it was not an inconvenience at all, and something moved behind her grey eyes that was not quite an expression, but was in the direction of the very early stages of recalibration. By the time the rest of the household staff had assembled for their morning routines, it was understood in that way that news travels in houses without anyone announcing it, that the new Duchess of Blackwood had not only survived her first night but had been awake before anyone expected her, reading correspondence that was not technically hers to read yet, and had done all of this with the composure of someone who had planned to be here all along. The days that followed were characterized by a quiet industry that Evelyn found genuinely absorbing. Blackwood Hall was a significant property, not just the house itself but the surrounding estate, the tenant farms, the mill, the woodland, the cottage industries that supported the families who had lived on Blackwood land for generations. It had been managed, from what she could observe, with basic competence and almost no strategic thinking, the kind of management that keeps things from falling apart without ever considering how much better they might function. Evelyn had spent years watching the Hartwell estate decline through exactly this kind of passive administration, and she recognized the pattern immediately. She began, in her careful way, to learn. She asked Mrs. Whitmore questions, initially about the house itself, and then, as the housekeeper's initial wariness converted gradually to something more like cautious engagement, about the broader operations of the estate. She requested the account books, which were brought to her with slight hesitation, as though she might not understand them. She understood them immediately, and what she understood was that there were at least 4 areas of significant inefficiency that could be corrected without substantial investment, and 2 areas of concerning expenditure that needed examination. She did not immediately present her findings to Sebastian. She was methodical, and she understood that arriving at a new house and immediately proposing to restructure its operations was the kind of thing that required careful timing. She spent 2 weeks simply observing, learning, confirming her initial assessments, and building a complete picture before she said anything to anyone. During this time she managed the household with quiet competence, made herself known to the tenant farmers by accompanying the estate manager on his rounds, and introducing herself to the families she met with a directness that they appeared to find disorienting before it became, for most of them, reassuring. Sebastian observed all of this from a careful distance. He was not a man who spent much time at his own estate, having found over the years that there was very little at Blackwood Hall that required his specific presence, and that the things he carried in his own head were easier to manage when he kept moving. He had not expected his wife to take the estate seriously. He had expected her to manage the house, attend to her correspondence, perhaps redecorate some rooms and otherwise occupy herself in the ways that women of her station occupied themselves. What he found instead was a woman who seemed genuinely interested in the estate's operations, who spoke to the tenants with the same directness she applied to conversations with him, and who was, as far as he could tell, quite good at it. He watched her, the way you watch something that does not behave according to the rules you have learned to apply to things of its kind, with a combination of attention and uncertainty that he found privately rather more interesting than he had expected anything at his own house to be. It was in the 3rd week of January that Evelyn brought her analysis to him. She found him in the study after dinner, which was when he generally retired to deal with correspondence from London, and she knocked and entered when invited and sat in the chair across his desk without waiting to be asked. She laid the relevant documents in front of him in an order that made the argument clear, without requiring extensive explanation, and she walked him through her findings with the economy of someone who has thought carefully about how to present information and has removed everything that is not necessary. Sebastian listened without interrupting, which was the closest he came to paying someone a compliment in those early weeks. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, and she answered both without hesitation. He looked at the documents for a long time, and then he looked at her and said that she was correct about the mill accounts, and that he had suspected the same thing for some time without acting on it, which was, as she understood, something very close to an admission. She said she could prepare a full proposal if he wanted one. He said yes, and that was the second conversation between the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood that ended with something that had not been there at the beginning. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the particular respect that one intelligent person develops for another when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. and in a marriage built on honesty rather than illusion, it turned out to be a surprisingly solid place from which to begin. The stories about the previous brides, the ones who had left before dawn, had always circulated as warnings or as entertainment, depending on who was telling them, but no one had ever really explained what had happened in any version of events that Evelyn found plausible. The explanations offered tended toward the dramatic, that Sebastian was cold, impossible, cruel in some unnamed way, that there was something about Blackwood Hall that drove women away, that the whole family was cursed in the way that English aristocratic families are periodically cursed in the stories told about them by people who have never actually met them. Evelyn, having now spent 3 weeks in the house and in close enough proximity to Sebastian to form a considered opinion, found none of these explanations convincing. What she found instead, through the careful accumulation of small observations, was a picture considerably less Gothic and considerably more understandable than the legend suggested. Sebastian was not cruel. He was not even particularly cold, at least not in the way the gossip described, the studied theatrical coldness of a villain. He was a man who had been taught that his function was his title, that his responsibilities were paramount, and his personal needs essentially irrelevant, and who had learned over many years to manage his emotional life the way he managed his estate accounts, with competence and minimal sentiment, keeping the numbers functional and asking very little of himself beyond basic operational effectiveness. The women who had left had, from what she could piece together, arrived expecting a different kind of story. They had expected the possibility of romance, of being chosen, of being loved in the warm and visible way that young women are told they should expect to be loved. When they had been offered, instead, the honest terms of a practical arrangement, they had felt, rightly, that something had been withheld from them, and they had left rather than accept a marriage that did not include what they had believed they were entitled to. Evelyn did not blame them. She simply recognized that she was, in a meaningful way, a different kind of person making a different kind of calculation. She had not arrived expecting love. She had arrived expecting honesty, and she had received it. What she did with that, she had decided, was her own business. Do follow the channel and share this stories with someone who needs it tonight, because there are a great many people who are quietly doing what Evelyn was doing, carrying things carefully and waiting for the right moment, and they deserve to know how this kind of story can end. Adrian Sterling arrived at Blackwood Hall on a Thursday morning in late January, driving his own curricle at a speed that suggested he was either very skilled or not particularly interested in personal safety, and probably both. He was Sebastian's oldest friend in the way that people who have known each other since childhood are friends, not because they are particularly similar, which they were not, but because they have accumulated enough shared history that the friendship has become self-sustaining, maintained by habit and genuine affection in roughly equal measure. He was sandy-haired and cheerful in a way that Sebastian was not, possessed of the natural ease of a man who has never met a social situation he found intimidating, and he walked into Blackwood Hall with the familiarity of someone who had been doing so for 20 years. He met Evelyn at lunch. Sebastian had offered a minimal introduction, first name, second name, the fact of acquaintance, nothing more, which was how he introduced everyone, and which Evelyn had already identified as one of his more effective methods of emotional management, giving the minimum information required, and therefore controlling how much engagement the situation demanded of him. Adrian, who had clearly met this approach before, ignored it entirely and introduced himself with the warmth of someone making a genuine effort to be kind, and Evelyn, who recognized kindness when she encountered it, received it without either excessive warmth or the cool reserve she deployed when it was necessary. The conversation at lunch was the first time in 3 weeks that Evelyn had spoken to someone who was not Sebastian, Mrs. Whitmore, or a tenant farmer, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she had missed it. Not the social performance of it, but the actual exchange, the quick movement of ideas between people who have not yet established the habits that make conversation easier and less surprising. Adrian was intelligent, and he was funny in the particular way of people who are also generous, the humor that creates inclusion rather than hierarchy, and she found herself genuinely engaged in a way that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the fact that he was interesting to talk to. She did not notice Sebastian watching them from across the table, or rather, she noticed it in the peripheral way that she noticed most things, registered and filed for later consideration, without placing particular significance on it at the time. It was only later, thinking back on the afternoon with the analytical distance that she applied to most of her observations, that she identified what she had seen in Sebastian's face across the table. Not exactly. It had been brief and quickly managed, the expression of a man who has felt something he did not expect to feel and has immediately applied his usual containment to it. She turned it over in her mind for a while and could not quite categorize it, and then moved on to other things. Adrian stayed for 2 days, and during those 2 days, the atmosphere of Blackwood Hall changed in a way that Evelyn could not entirely account for. It was slightly warmer, slightly more human, slightly more like a place where people lived rather than a place where a man was stationed between obligations. She observed Sebastian in a context she had not yet seen, talking to someone he had known long enough to be, if not relaxed, then at least less carefully contained, and what she observed added a layer to the picture she had been building of him. He was, it turned out, capable of humor, dry and spare, and so understated that she nearly missed it the first time, but genuinely funny in the way that requires real intelligence, the humor that finds the precise true thing about a situation and simply names it. She catalogued this. She catalogued everything. It was how she worked. Adrian left on Saturday morning, and the house settled back into its usual quiet, but Evelyn noticed that the quality of the quiet had changed very slightly, as though the walls had been reminded that they were built to hold people rather than just weather. It was the following Tuesday, in a letter with no return address, that the first trouble arrived. Mrs. Whitmore brought it to her directly, which meant it had been addressed to the Duchess rather than the Duke, and Evelyn opened it at her writing desk in the morning light and read it with the careful attention she gave everything. The letter was written in a clean, careful hand that had made some effort to disguise itself, and it stated, with a precision that suggested it had been composed with legal effect in mind, that Evelyn's recent friendship with Adrian Sterling was well known in London society, and that questions were being raised in certain quarters about the nature of their association prior to her marriage to the Duke of Blackwood. It contained no explicit accusation, but the construction of each sentence was designed to imply one, while maintaining the technical defense of having not quite made it. Evelyn read it twice. She set it down. She looked out the window at the January garden, grey and frozen and entirely motionless, and she thought with a clarity that surprised even herself. Not about her own position, not about the implications for her marriage, but about who had sent it and why, and what they expected her to do. They expected panic, they expected guilt, or the behavior of guilt, which in this case would mean silence and concealment, which would in turn provide the very evidence of wrongdoing the letter had been designed to imply. She had seen this maneuver before, not directed at herself, but she knew the structure of it, the way it was designed to work, the assumption at its center that the person receiving it would respond the way frightened people respond. She was not frightened. She was, if anything, interested. She picked up the letter again, folded it with deliberate care, placed it in the small locked box she kept in her writing desk, and went to find Sebastian. She found him in the East Wing corridor, returning from the stables with the particular focused quietness of a man who has spent an hour with horses and is not yet ready to return to being a duke. He saw her coming and stopped, reading her expression with the attention he had developed over the past weeks. The careful watching of a man who has learned that this woman does not come to find you unless she has a reason. She handed him the letter without preamble and stood at a slight distance while he read it, watching his face the way she watched everything, with full attention and no visible reaction of her own. He read it once and then read it again, and the quality of his stillness changed in a way that she had not seen before, not the usual contained composure, but something underneath it. Something that had moved before the composure caught up. He folded the letter with hands that were entirely steady, and looked at her, and asked, because it was the same directness she used herself, whether there was any truth to it. Whether there was any truth to it, she said no. She said it without hesitation and without the additional layering of explanation that guilty people add to simple denials, not because she was performing innocence, but because the answer was simply no, and she saw no reason to elaborate on a fact. There had been no prior association with Adrian Sterling beyond what she had described. She had met him twice before his visit to Blackwood Hall, both times in rooms full of people, and there had been nothing between them other than the ordinary pleasantries of social occasions. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that he believed her, and the manner in which he said it suggested that this was not something he had decided to do as a gesture of marital solidarity, but something he had arrived at by looking at her and making an assessment, the same kind of assessment she made about people, quick and precise and based on observable evidence rather than sentiment. It was, she thought, the most interesting thing he had said to her yet. She said that someone had sent this letter with a purpose, and that the purpose was not to inform him of anything true, but to create a situation in which she would feel compelled to conceal rather than disclose, and that the concealment itself would provide evidence for the accusation. She said she had thought it was important to bring it to him immediately, so that they were both working with the same information. He said that was the correct decision. She said she was aware of that, which made something shift very briefly in his expression in the direction of something that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. They stood in the East Corridor for another few minutes, discussing the likely origin of the letter and the probable intent behind it, and it was, Evelyn reflected afterward, the most comfortable conversation she had yet had in this house. Two people examining a problem together with the shared efficiency of people who think, which was not a thing she had expected to find in a marriage that had begun, as a contract. The investigation, such as it was, began quietly. Sebastian had contacts in London that Evelyn did not yet have, and she had an analytical mind that he was increasingly willing to deploy, and together they began the careful work of tracing the letter back to its source. It was not particularly difficult in the end. The kind of person who sends anonymous letters does so because they believe themselves to be clever, which means they generally are not, or at least not clever enough to account for the number of small details that accumulate around the edges of even the most carefully constructed deception. Within a week, a name had surfaced with enough consistency to become probable and then certain. Vivian Ravenscroft was the daughter of an earl, and the kind of woman who moved through London society with the fluid confidence of someone who has always understood that she is attractive and has spent 20 years learning how to make that fact work for her. She had, it emerged through discreet inquiries, spent the better part of 2 years operating under the belief, perhaps not entirely without basis, that her association with Sebastian Blackwood was moving toward marriage, when he had instead married Evelyn Hartwell, a woman with fewer social advantages and less obvious claim to the position. Vivienne had apparently experienced this as a specific kind of affront, not heartbreak exactly, but the particular fury of someone who has been made to feel that they have miscalculated. Evelyn found this genuinely interesting, rather than threatening. She had observed over many years that the people who constituted real dangers were rarely the ones driven by passion. Passion was visible and therefore manageable. What Vivian had done, the careful legal precision of that letter, the calculated framing, the use of Adrian's visit as the specific pivot point, all of that spoke to a colder and more strategic mind than heartbreak usually produced. She noted this without judgment, because she understood the mind that had produced it, and she found that she had a certain professional respect for its construction, even as she prepared to dismantle it entirely. Mrs. Whitmore, who had by this point crossed from cautious assessment into something considerably warmer in her regard for the new Duchess, proved unexpectedly useful. She had been at Blackwood Hall for 23 years and had known Vivian Ravenscroft peripherally through the social circles that overlapped with the estate's concerns. And she knew things, the kind of things that long-serving housekeepers know, that were not in any document but were nonetheless entirely real. She provided 2 names: women who had been present at a specific occasion 3 years earlier and who could speak to the nature of certain relationships and certain timelines if approached correctly. Adrian Sterling reached by letter and responding by return post with a speed that said something good about his character, confirmed everything that needed confirming and offered to come back to Blackwood Hall in person if his presence would be useful. Evelyn wrote back that it would, and named a date, and felt a small private satisfaction at the orderliness of it. Sebastian watched the assembly of evidence with the particular attention of a man who is observing something he did not know. He was capable of finding impressive. He was not the kind of man who admitted to being impressed, and he did not do so now, but Evelyn had become quite good at reading the language of a person who communicates in understatement. And what she read was that he was paying a different quality of attention to her than he had been 3 weeks ago. Not the watchful assessment of someone monitoring a new variable in their environment, but something with more weight to it, the attention of someone who has started to look forward to seeing how a thing develops. She noted this. She added it to the picture she was building. She did not yet do anything with it. If you have been with this story from the beginning, you already know that Evelyn Hartwell is not the kind of woman who responds to things before she has thought them through completely, and what she was thinking through now had several layers, and she was not finished yet. The formal challenge arrived on a Wednesday in early February, delivered by messenger to Blackwood Hall, with all the legal weight that Vivian Ravenscroft had apparently decided to deploy. She had filed a petition with the Blackwood Family Council, a body that had existed for 200 years and had the authority, under the terms of the Blackwood Family Charter, to review the circumstances of the Duke's marriage if sufficient grounds for concern were presented. The petition alleged that the marriage had been contracted under false pretenses, specifically that the Duchess had concealed a prior attachment that, had it been disclosed, would have materially affected the Duke's decision to proceed with the match. The language was precise and the timing was calculated, and anyone who knew how these things worked would understand that the purpose was not necessarily to win the petition, but to create the spectacle of it, to put Evelyn publicly in the position of having to defend herself, to make the defense itself the story, regardless of the outcome. Evelyn read the petition at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning and finished her tea before she said anything. Then she said, to Sebastian, who was reading his own correspondence across the table, that they would need approximately 14 days to prepare a response, and that she had already identified the primary lines of argument and the witnesses required. He set down his letter and looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with moments when she had surprised him in a way he had not yet categorized, and asked her to explain. She explained. She had been thinking about this, she said, not since the petition arrived, but since the first letter. because the first letter had made the eventual shape of the attack reasonably predictable. She had been building the response in parallel with the investigation, preparing not just the defense but the counter-argument, the kind of case that did not merely rebut the accusation but exposed the mechanism of it, the calculation behind it, the bad faith at its center. She had 3 categories of evidence, 8 potential witnesses, and a line of argument that she was satisfied would not just defeat the petition but make the cost of bringing it visible to everyone present. Sebastian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, with a quietness that carried more weight than volume would have, that he would like to help. She said she had been counting on it. He said he was glad, and the way he said it was not formal and not composed in the usual way. It was simply true, and she found, to her own slight surprise, that she was glad as well. The 14 days that followed were the most concentrated period of work Evelyn had done since she had been managing the Hartwell estate accounts alone at 16. And they were also, she recognized privately, the most genuinely engaged she had felt in years. There is a particular quality of satisfaction available to a person who is working at the full extent of their capability on something that matters, and she had not had access to that satisfaction for a long time. She found that working alongside Sebastian, in the study with documents spread across both their desks and the fire going against the February cold, was not the complicated thing she might have expected it to be. He thought quickly and he communicated clearly, and he did not waste her time with social management, and she found that the combination of those qualities was, in a working context, extremely easy to be around. They worked late on most of those evenings, and on some of them the work gave way, for an hour or so before they parted for the night, to something that was not quite work and not quite conversation but some territory in between, the kind of talking that happens when 2 people have been focused on the same problem for many hours and have temporarily stopped performing their usual social roles. He told her on one of those evenings something about his mother, who had died when he was 11, and who had been, from the careful brevity of his description, someone he had loved very much and lost too soon, and had never found a way to replace in the architecture of how he understood the world. He did not say any of that directly. He said it in the particular way he said everything, in pieces, around the edges, in the spaces between what he actually told her and what she understood him to mean. She listened with the full quality of attention she had been giving him since the beginning, and she did not try to fix it or soften it or fill the space it left with reassurance he had not asked for. She just received it and said something small and true in response, and moved on, and felt the weight of what had been shared settle into the room and stay there. She told him, on another evening, about the ledgers, about sitting at 16 with the Hartwell accounts and understanding, with the peculiar clear-eyed grief of the very young confronting very adult problems, that the people around her were not going to address this, and that if she did not begin to think about it, no one would. She said it without asking for sympathy, which was why, she suspected, he received it with the particular attentiveness of someone who recognizes their own experience in another person's and is slightly startled by it. He said that it was a heavy thing to carry alone at that age. She said she had not known at the time that it was heavy, which was perhaps the only advantage of being very young when difficult things happen. He said that was probably true, and the way he said it told her something about what he had carried young, and she did not ask him to say more than he had offered, and he did not, and neither of them needed him to. The hearing of the family council was held on the 15th of February in the great hall of Blackwood Hall itself, which was the traditional venue for such proceedings, and which, under the Blackwood family charter, could not be held elsewhere without the consent of both the Duke and the petitioning party, consent that Sebastian had declined to give. Evelyn had specified the venue herself, and she had done so for reasons that were as much symbolic as practical. This was her house, and she intended to defend herself in it. The council consisted of 7 members, 4 of them relatives of Sebastian's, and 3 representing the broader interests of the family's historical alliances, all of them elderly, in the way that people who have accumulated significant institutional power sometimes are. The weight of their authority compressed into small, careful movements and precisely chosen words. Vivienne Ravenscroft was present with her own counsel, a sharp-faced solicitor named Graves, who had a reputation for constructing elegant technical arguments out of ambiguous facts. Lady Beatrice Winthrop arrived that morning from Bath, having responded to Evelyn's letter with the brisk efficiency of a woman in her 70s who has no patience for unnecessary delay and considers dishonesty a personal affront. She was small and composed and had eyes that moved through a room the way a chess player's eyes move across a board, cataloguing the position of every piece. She greeted Evelyn with warmth and Sebastian with the particular fondness of someone who has known a person since childhood and has maintained a clear-eyed affection for them through all their complications. She sat in the front row of the seats arranged for witnesses and looked at Vivienne Ravenscroft with an expression of such politely contained contempt that several members of the council shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The proceedings began at 10 in the morning. Graves presented the petition with the professional smoothness of someone billing by the hour and wanting you to know it, building his case around the implied prior relationship between Evelyn and Adrian, the timing of Adrian's visit to Blackwood Hall so soon after the wedding, and the letter which he presented as evidence not of the accusation itself, but of the existence of a concern requiring investigation. He was careful and he was good, and he constructed his argument without ever quite stating the thing he was implying, which was, Evelyn recognized the point. She had prepared her own presentation, with the same care she had applied to everything else, which meant it was not a defense at all. Not in the way Graves would have expected. She did not rebut his implications point by point, because she understood that rebutting an implication gives it the dignity of direct confrontation, makes it feel more real than it is. Instead, she presented the affirmative case, the full account of the actual events, the timeline documented and verified, the witnesses prepared to speak to specific facts, and then, at the end, when the factual record had been established completely, she turned to the question of the letter itself. She had traced it, not just to Vivienne, but through Vivienne, through the hand of the solicitor who had drafted it, through the specific legal phrasing that appeared in 2 other documents Graves had filed in separate proceedings in the past 3 years, the same construction, the same careful framing, the same technical precision. She laid the evidence on the table in front of the council and allowed the members to examine it, and she did not say what it meant, because she had learned long ago that it is more effective to let intelligent people arrive at a conclusion themselves than to announce it for them. The silence that followed was of a specific quality, the silence of a room in which something has shifted and everyone is adjusting to the new arrangement. Lady Beatrice's testimony came next, and it was delivered with the measured authority of someone who has no need to perform conviction because she simply has it, and it addressed, in precise and devastating detail, the specific timeline that Graves had been relying on, dismantling the implied prior association between Evelyn and Adrian with the same efficiency with which Evelyn had dismantled the letter. Adrian's testimony followed, brief and direct, confirming the meetings in question and the complete absence of any prior personal connection, and delivered in the tone of someone who finds the suggestion mildly amusing, but is doing his best to treat it with the seriousness the occasion demands. Graves attempted a recovery during the questioning phase, and was handled by Evelyn with a patience that was very nearly kind. She let him make his arguments, and then address them without apparent urgency, in the manner of someone showing a piece of reasoning to its logical conclusion, and allowing the room to observe what that conclusion was. The council withdrew at 3 in the afternoon and returned at 4. The senior member, a man named Lord Alderton, who was 82, and had been on the council for 40 years, and had the bearing of someone who has sat through every kind of human drama and emerged on the other side with his sense of what matters intact, announced that the petition was rejected on all grounds, that the evidence presented by the Duchess was thorough and credible, and that the council found no basis for any continued question regarding the validity or the circumstances of the marriage. He said the last part with a specific emphasis that was directed not at Evelyn but at Vivian, and the room understood what it meant. Vivian left without speaking to anyone. Graves followed her, with the particular posture of a man who is professionally accustomed to losing and has learned to carry it without visible distress. The council members gathered in small clusters and spoke in the low voices of people processing something significant, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared from the direction of the kitchen corridor with a tea service that suggested she had been prepared for this outcome and intended to mark it appropriately. Evelyn stood near the window and felt something settle inside her that had been held carefully in tension for 2 weeks. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular satisfaction of having done a difficult thing as well as it could be done, and having done it with the resources she had and without flinching. Sebastian came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a moment, and she did not require him to. Then he said quietly that he owed her an apology. She said that she was not aware of anything he needed to apologize for. He said that was the point, that he had constructed this marriage on terms that required her to defend herself in her own home 2 weeks into it, that she had done so entirely without complaint and with a competence that put him to shame, and that he was aware she had not asked for any of that, and it had been asked of her anyway. She looked at him. He was not performing contrition. He was doing what he always did when he said something difficult, simply saying it, without the softening and without the drama, and she found that she had more respect for that than she had expected to find. In a moment, she might have expected to feel something more complicated. She said that the marriage had been entered into honestly, and that she had known what she was agreeing to. He said that knowing what you are agreeing to does not necessarily mean you had agreed to everything that then happened. She said that was fair. He said he would like, if she was willing, to try doing this differently. She asked what he meant by differently. He said he was not entirely sure yet, and that he would appreciate her patience while he worked it out, and that he recognized that patience was something she had already extended to considerable lengths. She said she could manage a little more. He said he was aware that she could manage most things. She said she intended that as a compliment and he should take it as one. He said he had, and this time the thing that moved in his expression did not stop short of a smile, small and brief and entirely real, and she thought, watching it, that she had not seen his face look like that before, like it belonged to someone who had just remembered that the world occasionally contains things worth smiling at. She thought also that she liked it very much. The weeks that followed the council hearing had a different quality from the weeks before it. Something had been removed from the air, some held tension that had been present without her fully registering it, and what remained was quieter and less guarded and more genuinely inhabitable. They settled into the rhythms of the estate together, which meant in practice that Evelyn continued managing what she had been managing, and Sebastian began, in small but visible ways, to participate rather than observe. He attended the tenant meetings she organized, not as a presence of authority, but as someone who was there to listen, and she watched him in those meetings and saw something she had not expected, that he was, when he chose to be, genuinely good at it, patient in the way that large responsibilities make some people patient and others merely resigned, and honest in the way he was honest with her, without performance. He came to dinner more consistently. he stopped using the London correspondence as an excuse to leave the room. On 2 evenings, he asked her opinion on things that were not directly related to the estate. The first time, a question about a situation involving a family connection and a contested inheritance. And the second time, something more personal, a decision about an old friendship that had become complicated in a way he clearly found uncomfortable and had not yet resolved. She gave her opinion both times in the direct way she gave all her opinions, without cushioning and without the social management of someone trying to be liked. And both times he listened to the complete answer without interrupting, and then sat with it in the way she recognized as his version of genuine engagement. Spring came to Blackwood Hall in the way spring comes to northern England, reluctantly, and then, all at once, the garden going from frozen grey to tentative green, to the sudden extravagance of colour that always seems, no matter how many times you have witnessed it, slightly unlikely. Evelyn had begun to spend time in the East Garden, the walled section that had been planted 100 years ago and maintained to the letter but never updated, and she had developed, quietly, a set of ideas about what it could become, what it could be, if someone who actually cared about it were given the chance to address it seriously. She had not mentioned any of this to Sebastian. She was still at the stage of forming things fully before she presented them, which was how she worked, and how she expected to always work. And the garden plans were not yet ready. But one afternoon she found him there, standing in the center of the walled space, with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face turned up toward the pale spring sky, and she stopped in the gateway and looked at him, and he heard her and looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment was entirely comfortable. She walked into the garden and stood beside him, and they both looked at the overgrown beds and the old stone paths, and the wall covered in last year's ivy that hadn't been cut back, and after a while she said that she had some thoughts about what could be done with it. He said he would like to hear them. She said she would need a few more days before she was ready to present them properly. He said he could wait, and the way he said it was not impatience contained, but simply the truth. He had discovered, somewhere over the past weeks, that he did not mind waiting for the things she was preparing to say. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the afternoon light was the soft, pale gold of a spring that has only just arrived and is still not entirely sure of itself, and she thought, with a clarity that was different from her usual analytical clarity, softer and less organized, and considerably less comfortable to examine, that she had not expected this. She had expected a contract. She had expected to manage something difficult with competence and patience, and the general self-sufficiency that had been the primary resource for as long as she could remember. She had not expected to be standing in a cold garden on a Tuesday afternoon in March, feeling with some surprise that she was somewhere she would choose to be. She did not say any of this. She said instead that she would have the garden proposal ready by Thursday, and he said, "Good," and they stood there for a few more minutes in the fading afternoon. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that two people only arrive at after they have passed through all the other kinds, and Evelyn noted it with the particular attention she gave important things, carefully and with full awareness of what it meant. It was the 3rd week of March, late in the evening, that Sebastian found her in the library. She had been reading and had fallen asleep in the armchair nearest the fire, the way you fall asleep in a warm room after a long day when you have finally stopped holding yourself quite so carefully upright. The book was still open in her lap. The fire had burned low. He came in to retrieve something from the shelves and found her there, and stood for a moment in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone encountering an unexpected thing and needing a moment to decide what it means. He did not wake her. He put another log on the fire, and then he sat in the chair across from hers with a book he had not intended to read, and he read it, or at least he held it and turned its pages at intervals. while the fire rebuilt itself and the room grew warm again, and the woman across from him slept with the complete unself-conscious ease of someone who has, sometime in the past weeks, stopped being on guard. When she woke, an hour later, she found him still there, the book in his lap, the fire restored, and the room exactly as warm as it should be. She looked at him and understood, in the immediate way that waking sometimes makes things clear, what he had done and why. He met her eyes without embarrassment, which told her he had decided before she woke how he was going to manage this moment, and he said that he hoped she had slept well. She said she had, which was both true, and she understood, not the only thing being said. She did not move to leave. He did not suggest that she should. The fire made its small sounds in the grate, and outside the windows the March night was clear and cold and very still, and in the library of Blackwood Hall, in two chairs drawn close to the same fire, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood sat in the warm silence of people who have come a long way from where they started and have arrived. Without quite planning to, somewhere neither of them had expected to be. She thought about the stories. She thought about the women who had left before dawn, and the legend that had grown up around those departures, and the way the world had constructed a warning out of a set of facts it had never actually understood. She thought about the night she had arrived at this house, the cold rooms and the careful terms and the distance between two people who had agreed to share a life without agreeing to share very much of themselves. She thought about everything that had happened since, the ledgers and the letter and the council hearing and the evenings in the study and the conversations that had happened in the spaces between the work and the garden in the afternoon light. And this. She thought that the stories had been wrong, not in their facts, but in their interpretation. Which was how most stories were wrong. They collected the evidence of what people did, without understanding anything about why. The women who had left before dawn had not been driven away by cruelty or cold or anything as simple as that. They had left because they had arrived expecting one thing and found another, and the other was harder and stranger, and required more of them than romance does. It required honesty and patience and the willingness to stay when the comfortable story you had told yourself turned out not to fit the reality in front of you. Evelyn had not come with a comfortable story. She had come with clear eyes and a willingness to do hard things and a capacity for honesty that she had developed over many years out of necessity. And she had stayed. Not because she had no choice, she was clear about that, but because she had looked at what was in front of her and decided each day that it was worth staying for. And now it was March, and the fire was warm, and the man across from her had put another log on the fire and let her sleep and sat quietly in the dark while she did. And she found that she had nothing left to analyze about how she felt, because she had been feeling it for some time and knew exactly what it was and had simply been waiting in her patient way for him to catch up. He caught up in the East Garden on a rainy afternoon in April, when the sky had come down close and grey and the garden smelled of wet stone and early flowers, and she was standing near the old rose wall with a sketch of her proposed changes, and he came through the gate and stood beside her and looked at the sketch and then looked at her and said, in the voice he used for things that cost him something to say, that he had been thinking about something. She waited. He said that he had spent a very long time believing that this, a house and an arrangement and two people managing their respective obligations with mutual competence and minimum friction, was the most that a person in his position could reasonably hope for. He said he no longer believed that. He said he was not entirely certain when he had stopped believing it, but that he suspected she was responsible, and that he thought she had probably known this for longer than he had. She said that she had had some idea. Yes, he said he supposed she had. He said he did not entirely know how to do this, the other thing, the thing beyond the arrangement, and that he wanted to try, but that he thought she should know in advance that he would make mistakes, and that his instinct when things were difficult was still to contain rather than to open, and that the same honesty in advance she had asked for on the first night. She said that she thought honesty, on reflection, was the right foundation for most things. He said he thought so too. She said she had been choosing this and him for longer than the arrangement had required her to, and that she thought it was worth saying plainly so that he would know. He looked at her in the grey April rain with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and unmanaged and entirely present, and she thought it was the most true she had yet seen him look, and she had been paying close attention for several months. He kissed her in the garden, in the rain, with a gentleness that said something important about how carefully he had been holding the feeling before it became something he could say out loud. She kissed him back with the complete sureness of someone who has thought about this, enough to know exactly what she wants and is not in the habit of hesitating once she has established that. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, then you already understand what it is about. It is not about survival in the dramatic sense. It is about the quieter and more difficult kind, the survival of a self that stays honest under pressure, the survival of a connection that grows in the unlikely soil of honesty and work, and the decision made every day to stay. Share this with someone you think would love it, and leave a comment telling us whether you thus thought she would stay. Because was never really a question. The only question was how long it would take the rest of them to understand what she already knew. The wedding they had in May was small and entirely chosen, held in the chapel at Blackwood Hall on a morning when the grounds were at their most extravagant, the rose walls coming into bloom, and the east garden already showing the first results of Evelyn's plans, the old overgrowth cleared and the new beds laid, and the paths re-edged in pale stone that caught the light, Mrs. Whitmore cried, which she would afterward deny. Adrian Sterling gave a short speech that was funny and kind in exactly the proportion the occasion required. Lady Beatrice sat in the front row with the satisfaction of someone who recognized a good outcome and intended to enjoy it fully. Sebastian stood at the altar and watched his wife walk toward him through the morning light, and his expression was the one she had seen first in the library on a rainy evening in March, open and present, and entirely without the management he applied to everything else, and she walked toward him with the particular composure of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and has decided, with full information and complete freedom, that this is the right direction. They made their vows for the second time in a chapel that had been the site of Blackwood marriages for 3 centuries. And the vows this time were different. Not in the words, which were the same words that had been said in that chapel since before either of them was born, but in the weight behind them, the fullness of too piemelt choice after a journey rather than before it. In the months that followed, Blackwood Hall became something it had not been for a very long time, which was inhabited, genuinely and completely, by people who intended to be there. The East Garden reached its full first season and was, by any measure, extraordinary. The tenant farms ran more efficiently than they had in a decade. The household had the particular quality of a place that is managed by someone who cares about the people in it, and the people in it have noticed and responded in kind. Sebastian spent more time at home than he had in 20 years, and he found, to his own continuing slight surprise, that he had not lost anything by doing so, and had in fact acquired something he had not known how to name before, the specific warmth of a life that has been chosen rather than inherited. Evelyn found, also to her own slight surprise, that the contract she had entered with clear eyes and practical intentions had become something her practical intentions had not originally included in the accounting, and she was glad that it had, and she thought about this, sometimes in the East Garden in the evenings, the way you think about things that are good, with a kind of full and grateful attention that asks nothing more of them than to continue. They had come a long way from the Wintercrest ball, from the corridor where she had stood and listened and decided, from the cold rooms of the first night and the honest terms and the careful distance between two people who had agreed to share a life without agreeing, yet to share themselves. They had come through the letter and the hearing and the long evenings in the study and the garden in the rain and the library fire, and they had arrived somewhere that neither the legend nor the gossip had ever thought to describe, because the stories people tell about difficult men and brave women tend to end at the first kiss and not at the long Tuesday afternoons and the account books and the tenant meetings and the conversations by firelight, which are the actual substance of a life shared. But the actual substance is the thing worth having, and Evelyn Hartwell, who had always known the difference between what a thing looked like and what it was, had known that from the beginning. She had stayed, not because she had survived, because she had chosen to, every day, with full knowledge of what she was choosing, and had found that the choosing itself was the thing, the real thing, the thing underneath all the stories, and that it was, when you arrived at it, more than enough.